Thank you, Aaron. It's great to be here with you all. This is our, I believe, first interaction with the team. Uh, so we're looking forward working with you on this interesting initiative. Uh, we will just share initially a few slides about IUCN and EBA, and then little bit why there is a need on ecosystem-based adaptation. I had a quick look at the presentation and other matters which were discussed last time. So we will build upon those and then go into how these standards were developed and how we can be used, and that will be followed up with question answers and also discussions about the way forward. Ecosystem based adaptation, and also just a little bit more introduction also. We started working on EBA, rather this term was coined by IUCN way back in 2008 during a workshop in Costa Rica, and then in 2008 UNFCCC COP, uh, together with members and partners, it was pushed forward during the negotiations, and with G77 and other countries, we were able to make it part of the discussions. And then 2009, we worked with IUCN and members worked with the CBD Secretariat, and it was officially defined and approved. Then, the whole process got started 2010. It was officially part of the negotiations. And then there is, as we say, there's no looking back. This is one of the fastest emerging concept for climate adaptation through nature-based solutions. And 2010, Germans BMUB, they gave a trust fund. Through a trust fund, we started working together with UN Environment, UNDP, IUCN, and TMI for the first mountain EBA project. Since then, there have been many initiatives, and we did a mapping of IUCN's initiative, and EBA is component in 58 projects in 67 countries where IUCN has been working in different sectors. And you can see these projects are in different areas and all over the regions. IUCN overall is present in almost all countries through members, partners, and country offices. So we are working in these areas which also have disaster, livelihoods, overall, human well-being along with ecosystems management. So, we came a long way working with on EBA together with members, partners, and other organizations also have many projects like UNDP also been involved around 60 projects, UN Environment also involved in 55 projects, GIZ in about 24 projects. But what's happening on ground is that everybody is trying to do things as per their respective understanding about adaptation, about ecosystems, about human well-being, climate change. And to date, in overall adaptation, there have been no standards. So what's happening, people took EBA also, and it started happening like, whatever they have understanding, they are just doing things. Some are just tilted towards biodiversity conservation and then defining EBA as co-benefits of investing into nature. And some people in the development sector, they just doing poverty reduction or human well-being and then calling it EBA. But EBA is not just whatever we've been doing and just putting it into a new bottle and calling it EBA. When we do biodiversity conservation or ecosystem management, the primary target is ecosystem services and biodiversity, and the core benefits may or may not help human well-being. Whereas in EBA, it is human-centric. It is to use biodiversity and ecosystem services to enhance human well-being and to deal with climate risk. So that's critical, that it's not business as usual, whatever we have been doing, But unfortunately, based on our evaluations, which not just restricted to IUCN, but I fortunately was part of a process when, together with the Nairobi Work Program and WCMC, we looked into over 70 projects, and almost 90% was business as usual. So that is very concerning that we should not look into EBA by just doing whatever we have been doing. So that's one reason overall to give why we are having this discussion today. So it's critical that when we do climate and adaptation and all this, together with indigenous knowledge, climate science should also be integrated. Many a time, again, we are mostly at extreme ends. Either we just look into climate science and data and all this, and then start looking, which is still rare because climate data is not available because adaptation is locale specific. And some people just rely on perceptions of local farmers and all this, and fishermen and all this. Local communities, they have been doing adaptation for centuries. I mean, weather-related events and all this, so they know what's going on in Africa, in South America, Asia, all, you know. But what's happening now with climate change, their ability is not coping with all the fast changing changes, which climate change is just, so frequent disasters and other issues. So it's critical that together with indigenous knowledge, we also have climate science part of it. And many a time on ground when we go, it happens that even adaptation is not climate smart. People just start doing things without knowing what will happen. Like this initiative in Cambodia, they started putting mangroves. First, it was at the wrong site under an EBA project. They started doing it on sand dunes. Sand dunes have their own ecology and are critical for local ecosystems and overall, dependent. There can no other, exotic species should have not never been introduced there. So those mangroves died down after 3-4 years. And then again, in one area, they started putting mangroves and they did not take into account that there could be disasters. So after 3 years, there was a flash flood and all the work went down the drain. So that's also sometimes we just think by doing something based on our perception and previous experiences, this is good for local ecosystems or humans, but it's not the case. We do need to see what are the disasters, what are the projections, and how to cope with and how to integrate those things within the systems. And also these ad hoc and pilot-based things are leading to maladaptation. For example, in some countries, people just did, okay, let's do check dams or water conservation without looking into that. For example, for check dams, downstream water that was less, and people downstream were thinking, oh, it is because of climate change or God or other, but freshwater availability, the beneficiaries were very happy. Oh, we are doing great work and this project has brought extra water to us. So they started selling it off and all this, but downstream people, they started suffering. Same way, downstream freshwater biodiversity started suffering and the fishery and others got impacted. So these are just the tip of the iceberg in a way, because so many maladaptation activities are going on. And then, gender, rarely we take that into account in a fully responsive manner. We just think that having men part of the discussion where we tell them what to do. So it's more of a number game, and conservation sector in most of the cases, they are not good as the mainstream development sector is in integrating gender into their work. So we need to be not only just gender sensitive, but also gender responsive. And the decision making should also be part of the processes, not just making people, just inform them, okay, this is our agenda and let's you be involved whatever we are doing. And trades off. So that's again very critical, as I earlier also shared that, if we are doing, for example, check dams, we need to look into okay, what other aspects and at what expense we are doing these things. For example, in one case in Sri Lanka, they did 5 villages where they were, flooding. So they did really good work, and those still being presented at best case studies. And now those 5 villages are really good. There's no flooding and all this. But after 3-4 years, they are now downstream 20 villages, they get flooded. So that's important that when we do things, we should do impact assessment. We keep sermonizing other people. Look, whenever you do any development initiative, there should be EIAs or initial environmental assessments and all this. But rarely people do environment conservation organizations, if they go into development initiative, any environmental impact assessment outside their project zone, because that's not usually required. And even many a time we don't do within our systems also, wherever we are doing. And we keep talking about landscape approach, but our initiatives, they are just activity based. That's critical, that whenever we do things, let's look into what we are doing and what can be the impact in the long run. And so many a time we do just cosmetic work to use standards and other thing as a tick mark exercise. And then, we say, oh, that's good. We are, having gender, women are part of it. We are looking into, there is nothing wrong with the biodiversity and other thing. So we have done that. So those remain on paper only. So we need to go beyond that if we want long-term sustainable development. We need to work in an integrated manner. And again, many a time we look into adaptation as a goal. It's a means. It's not goal in itself. That's why we think whatever interventions are we doing, they if those interventions are successful, we think if our project is successful, we need to go beyond that and see if there are links in a holistic manner towards sustainable development. So this adaptation is a means, not a goal in itself. It's ad hoc. Many a time we need to keep changing, because adaptation overall is a moving target. You may prepare communities for one issue to deal with climate change associated problems, but then there will be different issues. There would be invasive species, then there would be maybe flooding, and in the same area, after some time, there could be drought. So what we can do when we are working in a 2-3 year horizon project oriented approach is to work with them, follow some standards which will empower them to use that learning to apply that knowledge to other issues where they can have sustained development and can learn from each other. So empowerment is critical, whatever we do, local communities, local institutions, and that is only possible, and major contribution factor would be if we follow some standards. So now I'll hand over to Kat, that why we are doing it. So this is the premise, and then the development of criteria and how we did it and what is it all about. Over to Kat.
So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the criteria and standards for EbA, which were developed and finalized earlier this year by the Friends of EbA network. So this work on standards and criteria is based on the experience of over a dozen institutions working in EbA. It's based specifically on an analysis of more than 30 publications, as well as previously accepted aspects of EbA, such as the 2009 definition by the Convention on Biological Diversity, definition of EbA, as well as the principles and guidelines, which were developed by Andrade and colleagues, I believe in 2012 rather. those were endorsed broadly as well. And the standards and criteria are based on those principles and guidelines with the goal of providing a bit more precise guidance. So Erin has, I believe, circulated copies of the paper in both English and Spanish to all of you. So if you would like to pull that up to refer to, please do. Okay. Oh. So as you can see from this slide, the paper was authored by several members of the Friends of EbA, including IUCN, GIZ, and IIED. And it was endorsed by these institutions, including the Mountain Institute, and importantly, also by BMUB, who funded the development of this work and, of course, are the donor for this program as well, the Scaling Up Mountain EbA program.
Yeah. I will just share with you that BMUB, their M&E people, they looked into that and then endorsed it, and many of these aspects they are using as indicators in their new call, which came this year, and they would be using it for future M&E purposes also. And this was also endorsed by UNFCCC Nairobi Work Program, and they were also part and parcel of the whole processes. And 2017 SAPSTA, we did the adaptation synthesis report, and many of those things were guided by these principles and overall criteria.
So the objectives of this paper are essentially twofold. First, we want to sharpen the understanding among policymakers and practitioners about what qualifies as EbA. So what is EbA and what isn't EbA? We don't want to repackage business as usual, as Ali said earlier. Next, we want to provide guidance on the quality of EbA measures. So once you've determined that an intervention does qualify as EbA, is it strong or is it weak? You know, could it be improved, and how could it be improved? So I'll begin with sort of the definition. As many of you know, the definition of EbA as defined by the Convention on Biological Diversity is ecosystem-based adaptation is the use of biodiversity and ecosystem services as part of an overall adaptation strategy to help people adapt to the adverse effects of climate change. So the first criterion we identified, or the first sort of element of EbA, is that it helps people to adapt. As Ali said, it's people-centric. So we broke this down into two criterion. How do we help people adapt? The first criterion is to reduce their social and environmental vulnerabilities. The second criterion is also to, on top of that reduction in vulnerability, to generate additional societal benefits in the context of climate change adaptation. The next element of EbA is that it makes active use of biodiversity and ecosystem services. So the criterion associated with this element, criterion number 3, as you can see, is that EbA restores, maintains, or even improves the health of the ecosystem that these people are relying on and surrounded by. Element C of EbA is that it's part of an overall adaptation strategy. As we know, EbA often will not work if it's in a vacuum, if it's implemented separately from a sort of bigger picture thinking. So we have two criteria associated with this element. The first is that EbA is supported by policies at multiple levels. If EbA is going to be mainstreamed and sustainable, it needs to be worked into several different policies and sectors. And the last criteria is that EbA supports equitable governance and enhances capacities. So as well as being supported by policies, it also turns around and enhances the good practice in policy. So this is a sort of summary page of what I've just given you. Now, if you take a look at the paper that Erin circulated, as well, I think she has also circulated 2 program documents that Colleen kindly drafted for this program specifically. We have the 20 quality standards. So this is what we will be using in the program to determine whether an EbA intervention is strong or whether it is weak and could be improved. So there are 2 forms that Erin and Colleen have provided. Oh, they're coming around. Thanks, Erin. So they will be provided, and they're based on this framework. And you'll see those next week. So if you take a look at this, you'll see that on the very left-hand side of the slide, this is sort of a slice of what the 20 quality standards look like, and they are each associated with the criteria for EbA. So an example of a standard associated with the first element of EbA, that it helps people adapt to climate change. Criterion 1 reduces social and environmental vulnerabilities. If you take a look at this slide, Quality Standard 1.1 is the use of climate information. If we're going to reduce people's social and environmental vulnerabilities, we have to do an assessment of how the climate will change or not change in the near to long-term future. So we have some example indicators of what you could use in the program to determine whether the EbA is strong or weak. The next line, you can see other examples that we have for each of the criteria. And as you can see, this is a sort of continuum or a spectrum of EbA quality. It is very much subjective, depending on who is filling out this checklist, who they share it with, etc. So it's something that we are pilot testing in this program. It's something that we want to get feedback on as well as strengthen. So I would invite any of you, if you have, as you're filling out these forms that Erin will circulate next week for both past EbA interventions as well as planned EbA interventions, if you could feel free to give us feedback and advice on how to improve this framework, that's going to be extremely useful for everyone who's implementing EbA. Thank you.
On the last point which Kat just shared, that it's important that when you start planning your interventions and you use this criteria, please do record it. And also, if you know all the say processes or other thing, examples, indicators, please do also give your input, and we would need to have more example indicators. And then that can be our one technical paper, joint technical paper coming out of this initiative about the pilot testing of this criteria. GIZ is also doing it and has done a little bit in Mexico. So it would be very important, because of our 3 countries flagship and then the 3 expansion countries can benefit out of these flagship countries, how they did planning, and so documentation of this process will be really important. Thank you. Open to question answers, your reactions, and then we will have discussion how to go about it next. Erin?
Thank you. That was an excellent presentation, very helpful. Can you make your slides available so that the teams can use them in their countries when they're talking about
Slides? I trust this whole criteria also, and with your and Colleen's those 2 pages, I think that will be very important. So we can send out these slides.
That would be great.
We can also share the poster upon that these slides were placed on.
That would be great. And we'll update Trello. I know I've been a bit behind on this, but I'll be putting all the webinar material, or at least links to it, up on Trello, so everybody will have access to this and can make sure it's used in their context. Mireya has a comment. I think everybody can now again use their microphones, so if we want to have an active discussion, please use your microphone.
Hi, Kat. Hi, Kesha. Congratulations for the presentation. I wanted to ask a question because I saw the table, but how do you get the final result? How effective it is? Do you do like a sum, a mean, or I didn't understand how is the final result gotten?
Thank you. That's a good question. Oh, is someone else trying to speak?
I think that was just echo. I'll turn my.
Thank you, Mireya. That was a great question. So when the team was developing this paper, we did discuss the pros and cons of assigning numeric value to the continuum of EBA quality as a way to sort of, say, oh, a higher number means it's stronger, a lower number means it's weaker. But we think that because it's so subjective, filling out and ticking off each square, we didn't think that that would be as valuable as really going through the exercise with good thought and then looking at each standard and saying, how could, as we're planning the EBA intervention, how could we strengthen this particular aspect? And also sort of, and on top of that, the use of indicators is going to be very important. Identifying indicators for each aspect, for each standard, before the EBA intervention begins. That's another important part of this exercise, so that you can say, this is sort of the status of the indicator beforehand, and this is the status afterwards. And together, all of those indicators can tell us afterwards, or help guide us afterwards in assessing the effectiveness of the measure.
Just to add to Kat's points, it's critical that these indicators are based on a baseline, because again, when we were doing the evaluation, in almost 90% cases there was no baseline, and so if we don't have a baseline, whatever state of the art or smart indicator we have, we cannot say that was the result of our intervention, because there will always be other contributing attributional factors. So having a baseline at the whatever micro level possible, that will help us together with indicators to measure effectiveness of our interventions. So that's very important, and many a time we use the baseline as described in the project document. But let's not forget that project documents are usually done 2 to 3 years before we start implementing the project. So baseline together with indicators will help us to make a judgment call and use this yardstick. Sorry to hear from Nepal team that they missed the presentation. Maybe at some time and point we can have another discussion, but we still have 40, 50 minutes. So please feel free. We can go back a bit if you want. Nita and Co. Okay, yes.
Jorge Hortensia wanting to.
I have a question.
Yeah, me too.
Can I go?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah,
Ali, thanks for this very great presentation, terrific, and I went over the paper, and it was very interesting, the work that's been done. Congratulations. My question is concerns the fact that the 20 quality standards, very interesting, all of them are written, prepared from the perspective of the implementing agencies. So these describe would be very strong EBA projects, you know, for the donors, for us agencies that are implementing the approach. But I'd like to also, or the question that I have is, how can we also look at these 20 standards of quality from the perspective of the ecosystem users and the local communities? Take two of the quality standards as examples of how to deal with the fact that there are very high transaction costs in, you know, in making sure that the 20 quality standards are in place, monitoring and evaluation, and being in synchrony with national policies. You know, for a project, it's relatively, or for the, you know, the agent, the national agency, if there is anyone around in the territory being managed, it's relatively easy or possible to set up good monitoring systems of the status of the ecosystems. But for communities, they will have to find an incentive, a clear incentive to sustain the M&E systems. And from the policy perspective, it's usually that communities, quote unquote, suffer from policies designed from outside, and in a way imposed on them without proper consultation. And the standard calls not only for synchrony with policies, but also, you know, through another standard, you know, good governance, so that people are involved in the dialogue with the policies. And the point that I'm trying to raise is that the 20 quality standards seem fantastic, but they are very complex. And my question is, how do we look at these 20 standards from the perspective of communities?
Jorge, good question. Two things. One is that an EBA project cannot be an EBA project without community participation in decision making. So that's our main first, you know, part of overall premise here. And so they should be part and parcel of each intervention, together with, you know, these are broad and as comprehensive as possible. We try to do it from our internal systems, because standards are usually to, you know, to have quality interventions. So yes, they are from implementing agencies perspective, but we cannot have the outcome and impact unless communities, they are part of the decision making and all those. So if you'll see, you know, from the document, I don't know if you have the document, these are just the few which we put on the slide, but there are all those where indigenous knowledge, overall community participation, gender integration, and other part of the processes. So it's critical that they are part of all implementation and decision making process. And then again, there are issues, you know, if we are having a top down approach in projects, that will not sustain overall. That's why in, you know, during the presentation I was saying, you know, we go over there to communities with a 3 to 4 year of, you know, project cycle. And that was something which many of us have been shouting, screaming for the last, you know, 10, 15 years or so. And I'm really happy now BMUB, they are, you know, they were able to integrate that aspect, that adaptation cannot be addressed in 3 to 4 years, because first year is spent in mobilizing resources, human resources, planning, institutions, bringing them on board. And second, third year, you start implementing with communities. Fourth year, you start wrapping up. So this is just ridiculous. And then thinking that we will achieve any long-term benefits. So now donors are coming for long-term sort of solutions, which will be community oriented. So So these things can be addressed if we have, say, 10, 12 year of, implementation period available. And then again, end of the day, any tool, anything that will remain a tool and approach, we have to be innovative and overall how best to use it together with the communities and other stakeholders. So it's a process, and again, this was developed from implementing how best we can look into the standards, but from community perspective, those are part of the outcomes. Okay, if we achieve those and good strength, those must be part of it. But again, it's a complex and not one tool can be perfect to have everything. So it's a start, and over a period of time, after pilot testing, as we put it in its introduction and conclusion of this document, it will be a living document, and we will be learning and adding things from different aspects.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Juan. Thank you, Ali and Kat, for a wonderful presentation. Interest. And I wanted to call attention to something that is mentioned in the paper but perhaps it was not stressed during the presentation, but something that I found very, very important, which is that this framework, these quality standards, and perhaps more quality standards that we could add during this upscaling mountain EBA project if we can provide something new. But anyway, at least these 20 quality standards can be applied during different moments of an EBA intervention. Last year, for a systematization process we conducted with GIZ, we used a previous version of this paper to analyze different adaptation projects, and we found that some of them that had been planned and designed as EBA had a better EBA quality at the beginning when designed than after 1 or 2 years because of several issues. Perhaps the quality of the participation or engagement of some of the partners decreased. In other cases, it was different. Sometimes the quality of the EBA intervention increased during the time, but what was clear was that EBA quality changes over the time, and that is very important that we monitor the quality of the EBA intervention during the time. Then these quality standards should be part of an M&E system, starting from the very beginning with the baseline and with the EBA measure design, using these quality standards in order to identify and design the measure, but also during the life of the EBA measure in order to monitor how the quality could be changing. This is something that I found very interesting. In that sense, I would like to see or to work on how this monitoring system on the quality of the EBA will articulate with the whole monitoring system of the EBA project.
That's very good observation. Totally agree with you. Okay, this is how we should be using these. And again, monitoring and others should not be just at the end of it. It should be a continuous process. We should keep referring to and looking into our interventions, not just because of, over a period of time, different aspects keep coming, but climate change, is a moving target. It will keep coming up with different challenges. So the issue is that we need to be dynamic in our interventions also. We should not just, and the problem with the project-oriented approach is that many of the interventions have already been defined. So it's not an ideal situation where we are going with the communities, working with them with something to design together. We have a design project, then we deliver it together with communities. So there are already so many handicaps. So I totally agree with you that to overcome those handicaps, we need to keep looking into our interventions, the quality of that, and the challenges, and modify our interventions if needed. We should not just, and donors also need to be aware of these, and we are working with them at that level. It should not be a straitjacket. These are the defined interventions, and you have to follow. There should be a paradigm, and where we can keep changing things. So it's a process. Good thing is that donors are ready to listen and they are changing accordingly, but we need to come up with science-based evidence where we can pursue these changes, and all the points which you pointed out they all need to be documented properly so that we can make the required change. Thanks. Neeta, I believe you wanted to also ask some questions, or your team.
Nita, do you have a question?
I think the Nepal team is having a hard time connecting. I've asked them to type their answers into the chat box when they can connect, and we'll just answer them and they can refer back to the recording.
Okay, that's a good. So, it's important that, we see till they come up that, how to work from here, how we can have standards, if certain other things need to be unpacked, more indicators during the process, and his point about communities and all this. So this is a beginning where we can work together. And the good thing is Kat and we are, also leading FEBA. So we have our, sort of a good network, global network with over 50 organizations which are also implementing agencies, and many are working very purely in community-based interventions, and there are donors also. Now almost all donors, they are part of FEBA. So we have an opportunity, we can influence the thinking, both policy and practice, through this initiative.
Ali, I have two questions. One you might have answered when I had to step away. My question is how often we should revisit these. We look at these at the beginning of the project, at the end. What's a useful frequency, do you think, during the implementation and review of the project to, go back through this table and say, okay, where are we at now?
On the duration of the intervention, but one rule of thumb is that while we are designing the interventions, that mid-term and the long term. But again, it will all depend on the intervention itself and the local conditions. Then after looking into whether that qualifies at different level, then we can see, okay, we will come back to it depending on its lifetime or other things. But again, one important thing is that this is more of a guidance, so it would be, there could be some intervention which might be strong in one area, while, for example, biodiversity, and it could be a bit weaker on some participation, for example. So it's not that it's a bad EBA. It would be that looking into local conditions and what we want to achieve out of it, we can still, go with it. So it's not a straitjacket in a way that we have to follow each and everything. And similarly, when we are doing it, the frequency could be determined based on the intervention. But usually all MNE, have at least 3 times during the project, because it is just, we are already bit late. So we will be doing it. And then, so in 2 years or 2.5 years time, we should have at least 3 times.
Okay.
So again, it will be a judgment call based on each intervention and broad. But one thing is which, Florencia was also of the view, maybe, if there are quarterly meetings with the community and other, and Jorge's point from community perspective. So whenever we get a chance, not formally, but informally, we can have always be looking into our interventions and the quality of it and trying to avoid any maladaptation. Because trust me, after doing this around 80, 90 evaluations, lot of them, they fizzle out either after 1 year or so, or they lead to maladaptation in the end, either for biodiversity ecosystems or human well-being. So in adaptation, it's very critical, I think, more to keep looking back their intended outcome and the emergent outcome.
Right. I think this would fit well with Florencia's action learning concepts.
Yeah, that would
Flora,
be.
do you have a question? You still have a hand raised.
Who?
Florencia?
I already made my question. I think that you were out of the conversation you were a step away for a moment.
I did, yes. Okay.
Yes, I made my I made my my comment regarding or yes how useful is to apply this revision of the quality standards during the time from the very beginning, starting at the assessment and baseline, and then during the monitoring system. Yeah.
Right.
Just a piece of information. Yesterday, we got a request from CBD Secretariat. They also want to use it, and during the SEPSTA, they want a presentation through the Secretariat. So there is a lot of ownership, and that's why I think it's very important that scaling up, we come up by using it on ground so that we can keep informing the policy, which at the moment is very interested. So policy should be informed by evidence from the field, which we have opportunity working with the team, Scaling Up Mountain EbA, to inform policy through practice and whatever is working and not working.
Great. Ali, my second question is kind of not 100% relevant, but when you began the presentation, you were showing maps of where EbA projects are. And these were IUCN EbA projects, but there was nothing in Europe or North America. And I'm just wondering if you're aware of how broadly used EbA is in these places, which might be an interesting comparison because there's longer and hopefully in some places more complete data sets in a lot of respects, like climate data. It would just make an interesting comparison to look at those projects versus in more remote, less data-rich regions.
Yeah, one is that these are just IUCN and its partners and members projects, partners rather, not members. And in North America and Europe, we don't have field initiative. In Eastern Europe now, we are in Central Asia and other, we are having some initiatives. Those have not been updated, but I know there were some documents, and I can share with the team. Those took into account the examples of EbA from Europe, and there were some good examples where they're doing it at a huge level, nature-based solutions to address climate risks. So that data is available, and interestingly, and we're still not having time, UNDP and UNEP also used the methodology we developed at IUCN to do the mapping, and their reports are also available. BMUB, because it was done under BMUB, they wanted all to be put together, and we are still trying to have some time where we can do this. But it's a very good, maybe another analysis which can be done, how EBA approaches and overall adaptation that's being done in Europe and North America. So let's see if we can get some time or resources to do that analysis. It could be a very good learning, I agree with you.
It would be an interesting comparison, I think. Yeah.
The problem is, many a time when we attempted in the past doing some, we always have oranges and apple,
Yes.
because nobody is following any standards or anything yardstick. So comparative analysis becomes very difficult. So that's one reason that, if we start following some sort of standards, that will help us to do comparative analysis. That's why now donors are also so interested, and that's a good thing. Otherwise, this last call could be one of the last calls on EBA, because we are failing. By we, I mean the conservation sector and development sector, failing to showcase additionality of EBA intervention to a science-based approach.
Mm-hmm.
Donors
think
just
one, I don't know if I'd call it a caveat, when we look at this table, we can all use this, but I don't think we can really directly compare. As Kat said, the answers are going to be quite subjective. Use of climate information, it might be, for a certain context, very strong. You've used everything that there is. There's not much, but you used it. So I think kind of a general statement when we're using this, it's really about the site and how, or the measure and how that evolves. It's a kind of an internal evaluation. It's not to say, yes, everything's perfect, we're doing the best that we can. I don't think I'm making my point very well there, so I'm going to back up a moment.
I agree. These standards are, basically to ensure that we are following principles overall and internal criteria for quality control. For example, when we go to a grocery store and we buy things to eat, we are very conscious of what we are buying, and we buy certain things because we trust the quality of those companies. Basically, standards are to implement and enforce what we believe in and the quality. So that's why it will remain internal, but then together with other tools and other things, for example, we are developing with IAED, effectiveness, how to appraise effectiveness of project. And that's also based on a lot of perceptions and indicators. So,
right.
Together with different tools, we can come up and do some analyses and other things. So not one tool will be, sort of a silver bullet to do everything. So here again, we can use certain part of it. It will remain a bit subjective. That's what we all thought through and discussed when we were developing these. There will not be total 100% objectivity, because we also thought about doing ranking or other thing, but that will, again, humans will be doing it.
I would like to in that sense to say that I see these quality standards and this paper as an element for reflecting in action. So it is a document that gives you some, like a pathway to think on what you are doing and how you can improve the quality of your intervention. In fact, I am thinking that it could be very useful to add like a chapter or a part in the paper on how to use it, how to use these standards and when, although it is mentioned, perhaps, looking further in the sense of when to use it, how to use it, and giving this idea, no?
Yeah, I agree. And I believe, the work with Colleen and Aaron, putting together, just putting them in a box, maybe we could also have some sort of instructions. And that's why we are very interested when, all our field teams will start applying them, they should document it. And then maybe the gist of it can become some instructions or guidance. And then also what issues they faced, where they, sort of found where they, okay, it was difficult to answer it properly and other. So it will be a process, and we can further improve it, have some guidance notes, okay, how to use it, and then also maybe adding a chapter in the beginning or in conclusion also. So I agree. I think this is what exactly we were looking forward to, in our discussion, that how best to utilize it. So Aaron, the table Colleen has put together, maybe we can have certain, maybe some text also to it, how, to go about it, to further unpack what has already been part of this document.
Right. Actually, if you and Kat can give me feedback on that in the next 2 days, Florencia and Mireia are also looking at it and testing it on the measures that they did earlier. I want the final refinements. So if you guys can quickly take a look at that and let me know if there's anything that should be adjusted before I send it out next week. Let's try that first iteration.
Yeah. So maybe, let's aim for Monday. So we will send you, we will try to go through in next 2 days, and by Monday, I think we will send you some feedback, because we just have to.
That would be super. And then I'll send that out to the team Monday, Tuesday next week with the first revisions. We'll revisit it later on and maybe use the form again with new questions or instructions, but this will be the Mountain Global EbA team, the first time to try and use this. So everybody else be expecting it.
Yeah. And again, please be candid in giving your feedback and all this, because the objective is not to prove it, this is state of the art work. Objective is to improve it and to make it as useful as possible as a part of the suite of tools and other approaches we will be using. So all of yours feedback, comments, and process documentation is critical to move towards showcasing additionality of EbA, which the whole sector is failing to do at the moment.
I think that's the point I was trying to make earlier, is that when you fill these out internally, you just need to be as honest as possible, because it's not about saying, yes, we did everything very well. It's really looking at it and saying, well, we have this information, we could have more information about this and it would make it much stronger. So it's very important for this to be useful to address it as honestly and critically as possible.
Yes, Aaron, you said it so well. It's not a policing tool. It is just to help us.
Exactly.
So that, external people, we can improve our functioning. And again, no one measure can qualify as strong. If that is the case, then, perhaps we would see, perhaps we are not honest. It would be, it would be strong in some, stronger in some cases, weaker in some other cases, and that's all right, because that's how we operate. And no intervention can be ideal, because ideal doesn't exist. It is what we do, make some judgment calls based on our objectives. So please put it as a learning tool, not as on the basis of that your work will be evaluated. No, that will be looked at to improve our work and overall. And many of other organizations, they will get a lot of benefit if we can do it properly and honestly.
Right. I don't think this is something we would ever really publish. I mean, we would say this is a tool we are using internally, and you can see the evolution as we kept revisiting it, but it's not a justification of the measure.
Yeah.
Anybody else have any questions? Isha, you might be the only one with a strong connection. So if you want to speak for the Nepal team or have any questions, please do.
Nothing more. Maybe what we can do, hopefully Monday we will share our feedback, and then maybe all can have some sort of a deadline. They will go through this, they will go through the working document. Feedback, and then trying it out while defining the interventions and work planning. So, and then we take it from there.
So, we can hear you.
Go ahead, Isha.
Yes, we are in the process of doing our collecting the background information and then doing our vulnerability assessment. So I think this is good that we were aware of these 20 quality standards that we can use in order to design our EBA intervention based on the different based on the outcomes of the vulnerabilities. But are there any rules or like thumb of rule that certain EBA intervention that should meet this quality standards, like 10 out of 20 or something, any benchmark that we need to do in order to implement the EBA interventions based on these 20 quality standards?
Thanks, Isha. I would say that there is no strict benchmark or sort of numeric value, but if we as a team looked at the completed exercise at where you've checked off on the list of 20 standards when designing, and say most of the tick marks fall on the right side of the spectrum, i.e. on the weak or very weak side, then we would try to figure out where the measure could be strengthened and where it can't. We would expect that in some places it'll be very strong, in some places it might be very weak due to circumstances out of our control. So I think it would again be sort of a qualitative look, but there's no 10 out of 20, et cetera, et cetera. It's looking at the whole thing holistically.
And the criteria and other, if those are part of overall strategy, adaptation, biodiversity is not negatively impacted due to our intervention, or we can minimize. So there are always trade-offs. This notion of our interventions are win-win. I rarely find anything. There is always impact. Even if I am having a cup of tea and the whole community is having, there is definitely impact. So we need to have trade-offs. But if the trade-offs are that long-term, local, human well-being or ecosystems can sustain that shock due to our intervention, but if there are issues like, I'm sharing from real-life interventions, that some of our interventions resulted in downstream people not having water, or check dam resulting in flooding of 7 houses in Nepal. So, those things must be avoided. Where we just think our beneficiaries in the project area, they matter to us, and downstream people can, because they are not our concern. So those are few things which should be non-negotiable. The rest are all those interventions which we can always look and improve.
Thanks.
And just one point on vulnerability assessment, are we following any sort of broad something which is uniform in our project, Aaron?
Question we're working on right now. And I'm going to speak with Kat right after this, and maybe you as well, Lily, I don't know. And I'll tell you more about that. It'd be great if we can involve you guys now that COP is over. So that's an ongoing discussion being led by Florencia, especially at the moment, with the flagship country leaders.
Because there is a lot of learning from the first EbA project and elsewhere also, that vulnerability assessments were done, it took 1.5 years or 1 year. Let's not repeat that mistake. Based on our available resources, let's do a very, maybe another webinar or other could be on that once we have internal discussions, how best to go about it. And there are methods now and approaches where we can have, through using PRA technique, just do it in 1 week's time. And then if required, we can go in depth, but they should not be like we in Peru, and the rest were almost 2 to 2.5 years.
Yeah, good to mention. It is good that you mentioned Ali, because right now we are working, especially with the colleagues from Nepal, on designing the vulnerability assessment process. And yeah, right now thinking on the implementation of this exploratory assessment to have the broad picture, and later to do something more focused. But yeah, not to invest 2 years, nothing at all. Instead, doing it much shorter, and also how to do it in a participatory way, and learning from the flagship EbA project in Peru, working on facilitating the dialogue between local knowledge and science. This is what we are discussing right now with Keshav and the TMI team in Nepal, and also involving in this discussion other teams in the flagship countries.
Great. And after having some discussions, we will also share, I think we did with Aaron, because in Nepal, in the last first EbA project, we did it in, I think, 5 days or 6 days of a field trip, and then just putting it down in about 10 days, the whole thing. And that got validated after 2.5 years spent, $200,000, and we spent maybe 10,000 or less than, it was just travel of 2 persons and then going over there and spending time with the communities. And the same, outcomes were there after 2.5 years spending $300,000 or $250,000. Same we did in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and through a survey model plus PRA. And I have that questionnaire also, and we did it in 3 days. And when another agency, we know them, so I won't name them, they did it after 1 year, same results. So there are, again, end of the day, nothing is ideal in a way perfect. But if we can get a trend analysis and then look into our interventions, which in any way are time bound with little resources, so we should follow that. So maybe, Aaron, we can have another discussion and then come up with some sort of thing which can be adapted and adopted based on local conditions.
Yes, let's discuss this after we finish here. As I said, we've kind of got this parallel discussion with Florencia and Keshav, and hopefully Anu and James will be able to join shortly as well. And then we would like to follow up with a larger whole group webinar discussion in early to mid-January about this.
Okay, so we have no questions and all the good observations. Let's call it a day.
I think that sounds good. Jorge, did you have something to say? You can see that you're typing. Okay. Hey, anybody else? Any last burning questions? All right, thank you everybody for coming once again. Hopefully next time more people can join us. I know the Uganda team is currently in the field. Nepal is having connection problems and our Bhutan contact is sick. So we did pretty well, all things considered. We will meet again in January and more information will come as we decide on the topic and who will lead and the date. So for now, I would wish everybody happy holidays, although I'll of course be in contact via email. So thank you very much again to Kat and Ali for leading this presentation. I think it was really useful once again. And we will make all the resources available as soon as possible.
Thank you, everyone. And it was really good having this discussion with you and very good observations and questions. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye to all.
And thank you again.